I know you've been there because I've been there. You finally pull the trigger and purchase your first full sheet of plywood. Not a half, not a quarter, but a full sheet. Your shaky hand gives the rude lumberman your last hard-earned dollar. Driving home, you're in a constant state of panic. Oh, how mad is my wife going to be? But deep down, you know that's not what's making you panic. The thought of making a wrong cut just houses itself in the back of your brain. And after 2 dreadful weeks, you finally muster up the courage to throw it on your workbench and to lay out those first cuts. After a few pulls of the trigger, your confidence rises, just in time to realize that you had a dyslexic moment. 32 and a half, not 23 and a half. What an absolute moron. You head over to the fridge to take out your anger on an innocent domestic. Once you calm down, you head back to the workbench to reevaluate the damage. And then after wasting half of an afternoon, your stomach drops. You realize that you're not going to have enough plywood to finish the project. Again, I sympathize with you. I've been there. But in this video, I hope to show you all of the tips and tricks to prevent this terrible, terrible gut-wrenching feeling. Let's get to it. Please don't get any lighter. Wind doesn't help either. Whoa!
One of these days I'll get an employee. They could do this for me.
One thing I try to do is have my plywood be stored horizontally. It just gives it less of a chance to cup or bow. 9 times out of 10 it's going to anyway, unless you really fork over a decent amount of money on some of the good stuff. This is 3/4 radiata pine. Again, for shop projects, I think it came out to like 50 bucks. Actually, it's a little bit less than that. Kind of fluctuates in my area, anywhere from 40 to 60, just kind of depends. It has one side that is better than the other. The back side has some knots and some voids, which is fine for shop furniture. We'll just make sure that we put that on the inside of the cabinet. All right, the first thing we need to do to this sheet is take off the factory edge. That thing is terrible. No matter what you've ever heard, cut it off. Give yourself a good reference for the rest of your cuts. So let's get the track saw out and make that first cut. To make these cuts, I'm going to need to connect my 2 55-inch rails that are made by Festool with some Festool connectors. All you got to do is slide them together and tighten 4 bolts, 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom, and now I am able to rip the entire length of a 4x8 sheet. And here I'm going to use a guide block or stop, and it has the exact spacing that I'm going to need with that top piece there. So all I do is run it against the edge of the stock and the splinter guard of the guide rail, and it's going to give me a perfect amount of space. And here we're going to rip off that factory edge. And we do this because we need a nice clean edge to start with. Okay, so now that we have our factory edge, I like to just take a pencil and I put a star along the entire edge, just so I know that this is going to be my new reference. So now we need to figure out where we're going to make our cross cut, and then we can start breaking down each piece. Okay, so now that we have our reference side, when I was first starting out, I always liked to make a fresh 90-degree corner, and then that would be where I would work off of to get my dimensions for all of our pieces. To make sure that my cuts are square, I'm using what's called a rail square. At least that's what most companies will call it. This one happens to be from a company called Bench Dogs UK. They make phenomenal, phenomenal things. And I've had this for, oh boy, 2 or 3 years now, and they've upgraded their different versions as they came out. But what it does, it's gonna go, flip this around, there's a groove that's going to go in the back of your rail, and then you can tighten it up with these 2 levers here. No tool is needed, which is super nice. And then you've got your support piece, which slides. So depending on what side of the stock you're on and how you're going to make your cut, this can adjust. Super, super handy. Now you want to make sure that when you put the track saw on the track, you don't move anything, because that does seem to happen. You're able to get a clamp in here, but it's not the easiest thing. Another suggestion is to have a longer rail. So here, this is probably a little too short, but when I have my connectors, it was a little too long. We now have a perfectly 90-degree angle that we work from. And I always like to put a little square on the corner so I know that that is my reference corner. We had a reference edge, now we have a reference corner. So we're gonna make our measurements to start breaking this piece down. Now, technically, since we have our reference corner, and I know that this is a perfect 90-degree angle, I don't really need to make 2 marks, but I just find that it's a little bit, little peace of mind. So now what I need to do is I'm going to put my guide rail on the other side, and we just match up the splinter guard with our lines and give it a cut. Another tip, so when I was first starting out, I would break down the sheet in pieces that were a little larger than what I'm going to need for my final product, just so it's a little bit more manageable to move around the shop. So in this case, my side and one of my shelves gives me about 47 inches. I'm going to make a crosscut here at 47 3/4 just to give me enough wiggle room. So the first parts that we're going to cut out are the 2 side pieces. I'm going to insert a Beavis and Butthead little laughing gif. Is it GIF or GIF? I don't know. Anyways, so it's 26.5 is my final length for the 2 end pieces. And I'm going to cut them just a little bit larger. That way, if I am off square for whatever reason, I can take it to the table saw and make sure that both pieces are identical. So I'm going to measure up 26 3/4. And again, I gave myself extra space on this last cut for this reason. These need to be ripped to 20 inches. I have plenty of extra room. So what I'm going to do is rip them to 20.5 to give me that extra, just in case I need to make some final cuts at the table saw. Again, I just want to reiterate that we are making our measurements based off of this square corner that we made in the beginning. And since we're working with some shorter pieces, I'm going to adjust this guide rail. That way, one of the things my buddy Patrick from Leather by Dragonfly taught me is to mark center of your guide rail, and that kind of helps you balance out when you go to lay it down to make your cut. So in this case, I want the center of the rail about in the center of my material. And I'll just slide this up, lock it in, and slide it over to my line. And we're going to make the cut. There we have it. There is one of our side pieces. Same thing. I'm going to do this exact same thing. I'm going to measure over 20.5. Make my mark. Go up just to double check. Again, you really don't need that second line, especially if we know that we have our reference edge. And let's see if we have enough space here. Okay, we do not. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate this 180 degrees. I'm going to slide my guide rail up because I still want to reference this side, because that's what we referenced for our last cut. Right about there. And slide it over. So here's my reference edge, and it's 15.5 over, and it's 19.5 long. So I'm not going to worry about the cross cut right now. I just want to come over, I'm going to come over 16 because I have a little extra space for these as well. Make my labels. This is purple. Purple. And then what we have left over is going to be our nailers, and those are red, which I'll cut them and then I'll label them. Next, we're going to take these to the table saw and get our final dimensions cut. Okay, so a lot of different cuts were just made, but I'm going to show you when I was starting out the easiest way to not get them confused. Before I do that though, I want to go over a safety tip. So I did a no-no when it comes to table saw cross-cutting. I cross-cut a piece that was longer than it was wide. And in that case, you can get a lot of kickback and it wants to cockeye in there. So don't do what I did if you're not comfortable with it. However, this was big enough that it didn't end up being an issue. A good alternative to what I just did was to make sure that your pieces are completely squared up together, clamp them, and then you can run your track saw over it. If you have a big enough miter saw or what is that thing called? Or a radial arm saw, go ahead, do that. The best way to do it though is to use an MFT table, and you will have repeatable cuts every single time. So I have each one labeled with the color that corresponds with our SketchUp file. And I also have the dimensions written down on each piece. So I have 3 red pieces, those are our nailers, and they are all 4 inches wide, which I like to have the arrow there as well, just so I don't get myself confused. And as you can see, I have a check mark beside it. That is because we have already ripped these to 4 inches. There is no check mark beside 15.5, and that's because, yes, Jimmy, good job. It still needs cross-cut at 15.5. So we're going to do that now. Here's what's called a miter sled. Now, I have the privilege of using probably one of the best ones on the market, in my opinion. I have a bunch of different ones from different companies, but the auto scale from Woodpeckers is very, very nice. However, when I was starting out, I made my own crosscut sled on my job site table saw, used it for hundreds of different projects, and it worked just as well. So here, what we need to do is make one cut to square up the end. We'll flip it 180 degrees, use our fence here and our stop to make the same cut every single time. So what I'm doing here is called reference measuring. So instead of actually taking a tape measure to the piece, I'm bringing the piece to the saw so I can get the exact width that I need. And this is going to be really important because I want the dividers to be the same as the nailers. That way when I go to assemble, everything will be nice and flush.